Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. This is episode 14. My name is Matt Wood, and I recently sat down with Adam Saake of Perch Wine Company to talk about his journey in wine and life. Adam is a Sacramento native who's worked harvest in Chile and New Zealand, as well as El Dorado and Amador counties in the Sierra foothills of California. We discuss his love for Sacramento, learning from others, some of the vineyards he's working with, and how we can best support a small independent winemaker like himself and many of the others that appear on this podcast. We originally tried to record on the roof at Franquette, which is a great little wine bar and cafe in West Sacramento. Try the quiche, it's delicious. But because of some music at the park across the street, we relocated to Adam's home and had a great discussion. Here we go.
Unconventional Sauvignon Blanc that's entered into a new realm and it's totally delicious. Wish I made more of it.
Like the Syrah when I had that.
Yeah.
That was the one that I was like, oh, this is
Which vintage was that?
21.
The 21. Yeah. Cool.
But like especially as it opened up, like being open for a
couple
couple hours.
Day 2, day 3 on that wine is like,
is it?
If you can wait that long.
I did not, but I waited like 4 hours or something.
Yeah, that wine is, I really like the wine a lot, and it took me a moment to love the wine because I picked it a little earlier than I wanted to.
Okay.
You know, we were talking earlier about sort of being at the mercy of, other people's pick dates, and for different reasons that were, beyond me, and my control, I was able to pick that vineyard, the Bailey Vineyard, in which is it's about 2,900 feet elevation, in kind of close to the town of Volcano there. So it's in the Amador AVA, the big Amador AVA, but it's neither in the Fiddletown nor in the Shenandoah Valley AVA, and so it's pretty high up there. It's a pretty wild and kind of feral and interesting vineyard. And wild and feral, I mean that like kind of the area and kind of like getting up there. And and so in 20, so I made the first wine in 19, and I just kind of was given the fruit. I piggybacked on a pick and just kind of showed up and took my bin. And then in 20 and 21, I picked my own fruit.
Okay.
So I called my own pick. So
yeah, I
picked those wines picked that fruit a little earlier. The 20 vintage I thought was stellar. It took a little time for it to kind of warm up, but I think that wine is drinking really, really great, and it's like a super interesting wine. And then 21 was the Caldor Fire, and so I ended up picking the Syrah and the Zinfandel kind of like right around the same sugars, which was like I think just way earlier than I would have normally picked it. And so those wines ended up being very low alcohol, and the ripeness wasn't where I personally would have liked it. Like I wouldn't have chosen that. Like if you asked me to do it again, but I'm extremely proud of those wines, and the Zinfandel in particular did really well for me in terms of audience, like sort of like tasting that wine and being like, oh wow, like this is so interesting because we're so used to Zinfandel kind of tasting like this and having this sort of style and being in this sort of style, and then people sort of being like, wow, this is like, it's like high acid and there's like still fruit. And it's like, a lot of people were like, it just kind of reminds me of like drinking like Beaujolais or something like that, which I thought was kind of interesting because a buddy of mine and I are sort of really interested in some of the older Chez Panisse menus. And, they've always been, Chez Panisse has always been like a huge proponent of Zinfandel.
Yeah.
Like they've always had Zinfandel on the menu.
It's always been their like house wine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like Chez Panisse is sort of historically tied into like the evolution and sort of the history of Zinfandel, and they had a Zinfandel Nouveau dinner. So it's just kind of funny that like and my buddy Tyler he has a wine he has a brand called Commune, and he made a Zinfandel Nouveau, and he put like the Nouveau stamp on the label. Is really neat. And so I wasn't trying to make a Nouveau style wine, you know what I mean? Again, but just you and I were sort of briefly talking about this, how there's just these circumstances that happen that affect how the wine turns out that aren't necessarily like in your control.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not necessarily these like super like thought out, drawn out, calculated decisions. And they end up having an effect on the wine. And sometimes that is negative,
Sure.
and the wine is like messed up and you're like, wow, that's terrible.
Well,
Like
fire and things like that.
exactly.
There's no
Yeah.
accounting for that.
Yeah, exactly. And then sometimes it works out, if luck is on your side, because I really do think it has a lot to do with luck in a lot of ways. Sometimes luck is on your side, and I think so. I think the Zinfandel turned out really great, and so the Syrah, it was. I mean, I didn't release it at first because I was like, I don't know how people are going to receive this, but in time, it's really grown on me personally, and I think the wine's really neat, and it's taught me a lot about what the vineyard can do, and what sort of flavors and aromatics that the wine has that I wouldn't have picked out at higher sugars. So every single year that I make wine is a lesson for me. I'm at the very beginning of my career. So it's like I'm learning something new every single time I make a wine, So it's not like this podcast isn't going to be me sitting here talking about like, for the past 30 years, I've learned that here's what the vineyards do. And both, like, that's just not my story at this moment in time. Like my story is about learning from the wines and learning from the vineyards and learning kind of what I'm doing and where I'm going and what works and what doesn't. And what I want from the wines and what people want from the wines and how those two things intersect. And, so. But yeah, thanks. I'm happy that you like the 2022. Fingers crossed. Of course, as I always say, there's plenty of time to fuck it up. But the 2022 Syrah is like just unreal. It's just like picked it riper. I piggybacked on a pick. So again, I didn't call that one. So everybody kind of wanted to pick riper, and so I just was like, hey, I'm just grateful to get fruit again, frost. So like that vineyard was like, here's what's available to you. And I was like, great. I was like, if I'm getting fruit, I'm happy. I don't care if it comes in at, 25, 26, whatever. Like, I'm just happy to get fruit. I'm going to make the best wine I can from it. And it just like, just at those sugars, like the vineyard is just like just firing on all cylinders. So I'm really excited to bottle that and like put that out in the world, because part of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to like be like, hey, like, I work with these vineyards for a reason, right? Like if I made the wine in 1 year and then I didn't like it, I'm not going to come back to it. But if I make the wine and I go, wow, dude, that's so great. Like I'm not going to deviate from that. I want to stick. And that's kind of what most winemakers do, right? Like you find a great vineyard source and like, you're not just like, oh, well, I'm already bored and I'm going to go find another vineyard. It's like, you're like, whoa, like this makes like killer wine from this vineyard. And so you want to stick with it. And so I want to show people like, hey, like these vineyards that I'm working with make really great wine, and here's why. Like it's proof is in the pudding,
How'd you get into that Bailey vineyard? How did you find out about it?
That was all Tegan.
Okay.
Yeah. Because Tegan has Tegan bought property up in Volcano, and he just put rootstock in the ground, and he's been working on that for the past however many years. I've lost track of time at this point, but he's been working on it for at least 2 or 3 years. Yeah, definitely since 2020 for sure. I think he bought the property in 20, if I remember correctly. So I was working for Turley in 2000. I worked at Harvest in 18, and then I worked a full year there in 19. And I think he kind of already had his eye like on Volcano. Like he was like, this is a spot where I want to make wine from. I think it's like super neat. Like the soils are cool. Like it's like
great.
It's high elevation.
Yeah.
And I think he kind of already had his eye on it. And him and I were just kind of getting to know each other. And like, he was my boss. And so like, we, he knew that I wanted to make my own wine. That was the goal. I was kind of done working internships at that point. So Turley was the first like full-time job that I had where I worked a full year, from like, from beginning to end, really, if you will, for a vintage. Because I got to see the 18s go into bottle, and I made those wines, and then I got to, make the 19s and kind of see those all the way through, until, until the winter. So, so just kind of really kind of getting to know the vineyard a little bit more and kind of having that time. So Tegan and I and Nick Finarelli, the winemaker, at the facility in Plymouth, the winery in Plymouth. And Nick is a super good bud. He's like such a good dude. It was just really great working with him. And so the three of us are driving around Volcano, and we had stopped at some point, and he kind of points up. He goes, you see that vineyard up there? And I was like, yeah. He's like, that's the Bailey Vineyard. Like it was called Wind Dance Farms. Ken Bailey is the owner of that. And Tegan was like, hey, like, you should make wine from there. And it was like this. I mean, I was like, I wasn't planning on doing that. I didn't think that I was going to be able to make wine. And so from for myself, like kind of that early on at my time there, and so I was just like kind of dumbfounded, and I was like, I would love to. And so it just kind of like set the wheels in motion for that. And that was the first year that I made that wine, and that wine is fantastic. So I just made a barrel of that, and then that kind of started the whole Perch project kind of in motion.
Well, you have the wine, and you started with the one Syrah for the first year.
Exactly. I mean, it was special for me to be able to, to make that barrel of wine there. It just doesn't really, that's just not how it works, right? Like when you're working for another winery,
yeah.
Like and I just think that I think that Tegan just kind of knew that like that's something that I really wanted, and I was, I had worked really hard to get to that point where I was, I'd worked multiple internships, kind of as many as I could in like a 3 to 4 year period. And so I think he just knew that was something that was like important to me. And so I think that he sort of like kind of put that out there for me, like, and I'm super grateful for that. But yeah, so that's kind of how that happened. And it was just a one barrel, but working there was like, I got to, we made Vermentino, which I totally love. Like I love Foothills Vermentino. I've always loved Foothills Vermentino, which I'm really hoping to make, one day. Like I'd love to make some Vermentino from the Foothills. It just the cards haven't presented themselves yet, or it's just not in the cards or whatever. So, I learned a little bit about, barrel fermenting white wine. Turley makes Sauvignon Blanc as well, and that's also barrel fermented. And so, this Sauvignon Blanc that we're drinking, this is a barrel fermented white wine. So, those lessons that I learned from working there, where have a lot of those lessons that I learned at Turley have informed, kind of directly how I make the wines, for Perch in a lot of ways. So.
Yeah, you did a couple different harvest internships, right? And
yeah.
I'm sure you feel yourself kind of remembering and taking from each of those winemakers that that you've worked with. And,
absolutely.
And helped out.
And also, you in certain ways, I mean, not with everybody, but there's things that you remember that are very like, they're very like rudimentary. So you're kind of looking back on your internships and you're going like, okay, like what I was doing was like that internship, and kind of what I learned from that was like ground zero, right? That was like the very like bottom of the foundation that was being built. And so you look back on those and you're like, oh, cool. Like that was neat to be able to like learn that and like get that information and be able to learn from that person and like whatever. But it's not like, I don't look back on some of those internships and go like, oh, that's right, we did that this way, and now I remember that, and so I'm going to apply that to what I'm doing. It's like, I feel like it's kind of like once you sort of advance your knowledge. I was talking to someone about this the other day that I wish I would have known this then, but I guess you can't really know that then because you know it later. But it's like, it's really important to ask like the right questions, right? Like if you have an audience with somebody, it's like if you're able to ask somebody questions that's like very knowledgeable and you only have a limited amount of time with them, it's important to know how to ask like the right kinds of questions. And I didn't know that then. So I feel like in retrospect, I wish I could have, I worked with certain winemakers, and I wish I just I wish I knew how to ask like the kinds of questions that I would want the information, now in this moment when I'm making wines, it's like, oh, I wish I would have asked how to, how does the fermentation work when you're doing this? Or, like how many, are you doing punch downs or pump overs or when, how's your cap management or like, things like that, like things that I'm curious about now. But yeah, I feel like every single internship that I worked, and again, I work coming back to luck, like I definitely was calculated in who I was working for and where I went for various different reasons. But also, I kind of just followed my gut, because I kind of didn't really know. Like, I just wasn't the type of person that was like, oh, like I'm gonna go try to work for like Shav, like in the Rhone or something, or or I'm gonna go, try to work for like, I'm gonna go try to work in Burgundy or whatever. Like, I feel like for a moment there, I kind of was like trying to sort of get some internships with some like really well-known people. But at the end of the day, I sort of was like, what's my end goal? My end goal I knew from the very beginning that I wanted to work for myself, that I wanted my own brand. So like in a lot of ways, right? Like if your end goal is to like start your own thing, like then your resume doesn't really matter. Your resume matters when you're applying for a job, right? So I knew that early on. I was like, okay, like maybe so-and-so in the wine industry is like, oh, like you worked for these people and they're not as cool or like they're not as well known or they're not as famous or whatever as these people. But like, why does that matter? Do you know what I mean? It's like, I mean, it does matter in the sense that maybe people might look at my resume, like listening to this podcast, or like look at my resume in interviews that I've done and been like, oh, like he worked for so-and-so and so-and-so. And like, so maybe the wines are just okay or whatever, and like, sure, people can draw that conclusion if they want, but like, I don't know about those people. Like, I'm not trying to, you know what I mean? Like I can't worry about those people. And so I knew that the resume wasn't the thing that I was shooting for, is what I'm trying to say. So it was more about what felt good. Who did I want to be around? Who did I want to work with? Also, I wanted to travel. So it was like, where do I want to go? And what place do I want to see? And what sounds neat? And because I kind of, what I told myself in the beginning was, I'm going to start this journey and it's going to take me years to get to the point where I'm making wine for myself. And so when I get to the point where I'm making wine for myself, there might be a possibility where like I start making wine and it's stressful and it's not enjoyable. And I'm like, man, this is terrible. And like things aren't going well. And like, I don't think that this is like the path for me. And so like, I just wanted to make sure that like, that it was really about the journey and not about the destination. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
so I was like,
exactly.
So that was on my mind all the time, and so, other people might look back and or might hear this and say, oh, that's kind of like a shitty way to like do internships, because you should be aiming to like work with people who are going to teach you all these amazing things and you're going to learn from them. And it shouldn't just be about like where you want to travel to, but it's like, I did both. Like I like 100% did both. Like I worked with Angela Hara and Felipe Solmaniac from Aquitania in South America, like two just insanely talented and very well respected enologists and winemakers. And I worked for Dieter Kronji in the Central Coast at Presqu'île. And Dieter's just so awesome and so talented. And Dujac, consults for them. And so like, you're kind of, there was, sort of that thing happening there. So that was kind of neat to sort of be a part of that at that moment and just kind of see what was happening there. And, I worked for Tegan and I worked for some really interesting people in New Zealand. And so, yeah, I mean, I got to do both. So it was great. Like it was, I don't think that I look back on that time and I really wouldn't have changed anything. I don't look back on it and go like, oh, like I should have done this differently or I should have done that differently. It's like, it really just worked out so beautifully. I'm not going to lie. Like I miss it. It's like traveling and making wine is awesome, and some people still do it. You know what I mean? Like, you've got some different projects that are, they're doing some, international stuff and they're doing their domestic stuff, and that's like super neat, So it's like people are still kind of chasing the winemaking bug like around the world. And like I've considered it, but it's just maybe not the right time.
I was going to backtrack a little bit, but you grew up in Sacramento and lived here your entire life pretty much, except for the traveling and.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sacramento is like super, super like near and dear to my heart. You know, I'm like sort of obnoxiously like prideful, like of how, of being a Sacramentan, you know?
That's good.
Yeah.
I'm all about the hometown.
Totally. Yeah.
Home team.
I love Sacramento so much. Like it's my home. My family lives here. My friends are here, and everything that I've ever wanted to do, like passion wise, like any project, any interest that I've had, from playing music to making art, writing, you know, making things, like any creative project I've ever pursued, Sacramento has just totally supported me, you know? With the creative arts, like not so much financially, like, because it's like, you know, being an artist is hard, you know, it's like, it's hard to make money, and it's unfortunate. Like I wish that artists could exist, not just in Sacramento, but like in lots of places. I wish more artists could make money, making work and actually like doing the work and having the time to do that, and it wasn't such a struggle for them. I would have pursued that, honestly, but I don't know. I think that I loved making art, but I think at a certain point I just realized that it just like wasn't like my calling, you know what I mean? But Sacramento has always supported me, and so I always talk about it in the sense that I've like, you know, lived kind of two lives in Sacramento. The first life that I lived was this life of music and the creative arts and being involved in a lot of that culture and a lot of that scene here in town. And that was so fulfilling and so rad. And there was just so many great things that happened and so many opportunities that I had. And then, you know, kind of once I turned 30, then like the next decade of my life was sort of like all about travel. And then travel sort of then bled into winemaking, which then was also about travel. And so I was like kind of focused on that for a long time. And now I'm kind of at this point now, like I'm about to be 40 in a couple months. So it's like, you know, I'm kind of finishing like another decade of my life, and it's kind of gotten me to this point, which is really exciting. But Sacramento has just supported me so much. Like it's just wild. Like I sell a lot of the wines like just in town, you know, and that's really special. And so, yeah, so, you know, it's just, to me, you know, I always talk about like practicing gratitude, because I can't do anything other than that, like most of the time. But, you know, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to live in the city that I love, which is not a wine growing town. Like, yes, we have the Delta, which is not too far away, and there are vineyards in Sacramento County. Shout out to Craig Harmeyer, and to all the other Sacramento County winemakers. There are vineyards, but you know, this isn't a winemaking town, right? And so, if you go to UC Davis and you get a degree in viticulture and enology, like you don't usually like stick around. You know, you probably go move to like those wine growing regions and you get a job and you start your career or whatever, right? Or you go plant a vineyard or buy a vineyard, and that's also someplace else, and that's kind of what you do. So I just feel super lucky that I get to do both, you know? I think this kind of comes back to what we were talking about before too, where it's like being able to like travel and do cool things and also learn from cool people. It's like, I just, you know, the term, you know, have your cake and eat it too. I fucking hate that saying. I'm like, who doesn't want their cake and also eat it? Like, I've hated that saying my whole life. I'm like, this is stupid. Like I don't give a shit how hard I have to work or what I have to do. Like, I'm gonna have my cake and I'm gonna eat it because cake is delicious, and I like, you know, I want to have it and I want to eat it. Yeah. And so like I've tried my best to do that, like with everything that I've done in my life, and I've had the support of so many different people, and I don't just do that by myself. You know, I don't do that alone. So yeah, Sacramento is awesome. You know, it's just such a wonderful city. You know, it's in so many regards. Like I just never grow tired of it. And I get bored with things so quickly. Like if I'm like not into something, I'm like, I'm over it, you know, and then I move on to something else or whatever. Like, you know, it's like Sacramento just never bores me. It's just, there's always something cool bubbling here. Somebody's always moving the needle in some way, making something delicious, making cool art, putting on a cool show, bringing somebody to town, like nurturing some artist, nurturing some idea, building some new concept, like trying to move what we're doing forward and make it more interesting, and also just kind of like holding on to like also what makes Sacramento cool, like from like where where we were, where we came from, holding on to the past, and it's a mixture of all those things. And yeah, I love it here. I love Sacramento. I love Sacramento people.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So how did you get into wine?
That was something that happened in kind of a really organic, like non-industry related way. Like I think that I just we were talking about origin stories, you know, and so many people have like very similar origin stories, right? It's like, oh, like I moved to town, I was in my 20s and I moved to this town and I got like, I got a job at a wine shop and this mentor like took me on and like taught me a whole bunch of, we tasted every Thursday and I learned everything about wine. And then I got a job at a restaurant. I was a sommelier and they had a huge wine program. It's like, and that's an awesome story. Like, I'm like, man, like, I kind of wish that was my story because like I'd probably know a whole lot more about wine and I probably would have, like drank a little bit more DRC at this point. You know what I mean? It's like, and I'm like, oh man, that sounds like a cool story, But a lot of the origin stories are kind of that. And it's like, I've always had mentors and I've always had people who open great bottles for me. So my story is not totally different in that way. But I just kind of came into wine like through the window, like through the open window of like starting to really love food. And I think that's kind of where it began. I don't really even know how it started. Like I'm trying to remember, I always try to remember like what, like kind of the moment, but I just think that once I started realizing that I really like to eat, and like eating was like something that brought me a lot of pleasure, then I just started to go like, okay, like if I'm going to, learn about food and I want to eat better, I'm going to have to learn how to cook for myself. And so that was kind of a really slow process of like trying to understand how to do that for myself. Like I was so terrible. Like when I first started, like I knew nothing, and my stepsister, Jen, is a chef and she has been for many years. And so when I was like in my 20s and I was like, just kind of learning how to cook for myself, I'd be in the grocery store and be like, hey, I don't know, I kind of just want to make this thing and like I need to make a sauce. Like, how do you make sauce? And she'd be like, all right, like, okay, like get some, you need white wine, you need some shallots, you need some garlic. Like, I like to throw a little mustard in there. You can like thicken it with this and blah, 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 like some stock. And like, and she would just kind of be like, here's how you kind of do this. And like, what, and I'm like, okay. And like, I was just kind of like trying to figure out like how to do that. I think one of the first things I ever cooked for myself that I was like kind of proud of was like tri-tip. I was like, yeah, I can cook tri-tip. You know what I mean? And I was like, okay, like,
it's
okay.
Good California food.
You know what I mean? Yeah, exactly. I was like, okay, tri-tip, sure. So it started at very humble beginnings. And then I remember I tried to I bought Cornish game hens one night and I tried to cook them and it just came out it was just terrible. Like I just botched like the Cornish game hens, which is like,
it's a step up from tri-tip.
You know what I mean? And I was like, I remember trying to do that. And I was really trying to cook for myself. And that like kind of the food thing was obviously like very like tied to the wine thing. And so I ran into an old buddy who I had known for many years. We grew up together in East Sacramento, and his name is Leon Moore. And he was working at this wine bar, like one of the OG really cool wine bars. It was like, I think kind of ahead of its time. It was called L Wine Lounge.
Okay.
And so this was in Sacramento, in downtown Sacramento on L Street. So he was working there and he was kind of like pursuing the sommelier route. And I kind of knew nothing about any of this. I didn't know what a sommelier was. I didn't know anything about wine. I had been kind of drinking wine, but it was like I went to Safeway, and I was like, oh, like what label looks the most sophisticated? That's probably like the best wine on the shelf. And that's sort of the extent of what I knew about wine.
Okay.
And then I went in there, and this is a very vivid memory. So I went in there one night with a roommate of mine at the time, and then a couple other people that we were friends with, and we sat at the table. We sat at the table upstairs, and Leon was our server, and he came up, and we were ordering a glass of wine, and they had. By the way, this is not my aha wine. Okay, I'm not describing my aha wine. Okay. Because I don't really drink a whole lot of this wine, but so we were looking at by the glass stuff, and there was a glass of Chateauneuf du Pape, and I was like, "What is this?" He's like, "Oh man." He's like, this is like such a great glass of wine. He's like, it's crazy. Like it's got like, it tastes like leather and like cigar box and like gunpowder and black pepper. And he was like describing all these things, like a lot of like what we would consider secondary, like non-fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, I'd never fucking heard anybody talk about wine like that. I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I just had never heard anybody speak about wine in that way, you know? And I was just like, I can't wait to drink this. You know, I remember the anticipation building, like when we ordered the glass of wine and it was about to show up. Like, I'm getting goosebumps just like talking about it. And I remember just like drinking that wine. And it was really kind of like, and, you know, again, people who are listening to this are going to be like, well, how come that's not your aha wine? Well, it's not my aha wine because, you know, it's not the wine that really like made me want to like keep drinking wine. It was just the wine that like made me realize that wine was something really interesting. And it was like a really nice glass of wine. And I just hadn't really had that before because I had only really had grocery store wine, you know? And, you know, no, I'm not knocking all grocery store wine, by the way, but I think most of our listeners, your listeners will know what I'm talking about, like kind of the bottom of the shelf, mass produced. So that was kind of it. And then Leon and I started drinking wine together and we kind of began, you know, hanging out and kind of became super close friends, you know, after kind of a hiatus of kind of doing our own thing. And he is from his family's from Australia, and he introduced me to Shiraz, which is obviously Syrah. And so, you know, that was kind of like, that was the aha wine. You know? Like Shiraz was like we cracked like a bottle of, you know, like '08. I think it was like an '08. I'm trying to remember. I can't remember the producer. Like this is why I'm not a sommelier, because I have a shitty memory. Like I literally I can recognize labels, you know, and I can taste wines and remember wines, but I can't. It's just memorizing producers is just exhausting. I just don't have the memory for it anymore. He brought over kind of an aged Shiraz, and I just remember being like, whoa, this is so dope. Like, and that's kind of the moment I fell in love with Syrah. You know, and again, like Tegan like loves Syrah, and the first wine I ever made was from a Syrah vineyard. Like, I mean, all that stuff is like not an accident. You know, all that that was like the beginning of all that. And I wasn't working in the service industry like at all. Like I was not a server. I was not a sommelier. I was not I had worked a little bit in the industry, like kind of in my like mid to late teens, but like I was not a wine guy. Wine was just pleasure. Like I'm a hedonist. Like I love eating. I love drinking wine. It was just pleasure, you know? And so I love that that's how it started for me, because it grounded me in just the love of it, you know? And then everything was a sort of a launching pad for everything else in my life, you know, in the wine and food industry, was just from a love of it, you know, from cooking to drinking wine. Like it's just those things have always been for me, you know?
So how did you decide to sort of transition into the wine industry with your internships, and what was the impetus to try to get an internship in the wine industry?
Yeah. So that was kind of crossing things off of a list in a lot of ways. That's kind of how I talk about it. I had started working in the industry before I started learning to make wine. I like did my like first level court, you know, at the Bellagio Hotel in Vegas, which is just so hilarious to me, because you're walking to participate in like a sensory evaluation, and just as you're just walking through cigarette smoke, I was like, that was the first indication that this was not for me. Kind of funny. Yeah, and I had a really bad experience at that, and it just completely turned me off from being a sommelier. So that's part of my answer. So I was, you know, working in the industry, and I was like kind of going down that road, and I was trying to learn as much as I could about wine. And I was like studying and, you know, drinking a lot of wine, and you know, I had a lot of really great mentors in Sacramento, and so I was like, okay, I'm okay at this, you know, like I'm not special. I'm not like super talented, you know, like I didn't think that I was going to be this like amazing sommelier. And like, I didn't think that I was going to do anything really important in that regard. And then once I started to go down the route of the court, and I kind of was like, okay, this is the route that you go to kind of get to this point. And I had some people that I was drinking wine with who were also kind of going that route. And I'm friends with a lot of people who are sommeliers and who like are still involved in the court and who like have gone through, who have become, certified, like advanced. Like I've known, multiple people, and some of those people are like my close friends and are really, really good people. I just think generally speaking, like that group of folks who are like, or sommeliers, I just didn't really fit in with those people. I felt in a lot of ways, just for various different reasons. Also, I've just never really been a joiner, and so it's like, I just don't, I kind of just like to kind of do my own thing and I like to do it my way. And that's kind of always how I've been. So that was not for me. So I kind of crossed that off. And then some of my friends who were sommeliers, like eventually became wine salesmen. And so I got to see that firsthand. And I was like, okay, like I'm just too punk rock and I got too many tattoos and I swear too much, like to put on a suit every day and try to sell wine, So I was like, that's not for me. So I crossed that off. And then working in the restaurant industry, I just knew was not sustainable. I was like, there's just no way that like I'm going to be, I'm going to enter into my like late 30s, 40s, maybe even 50s and like still want to be like on the restaurant floor. So I was like, bar manager, like floor somm, like wine director, like that's not for me. So I crossed that off. So I just was crossing off more things than I was circling things. And the thing that I really hadn't done was I hadn't worked a harvest. And so, so that's kind of where that idea came from. And I really wanted to do that. And that idea came from, again, from sort of like wanting to shake things up in my life.
Okay.
I wanted to like get out, kind of go away from Sacramento for a little while, go do something else, go live a different life, go try some other things, go see some different landscape. And I really wanted to kind of get out of what I was doing at the time. And so I was baling hay in Oregon. 2 summers in a row. I was driving tractor.
Okay.
Which is kind of random.
Different, yeah.
Very different.
Yep.
And that was an old friend of mine. His family did that in the Willamette Valley. And so like I just said, hey, can I do that? And he was like, yeah, I'll set you up. So I did that for 2 summers in a row. I was in the Willamette Valley. I was drinking a lot at this time, this was like 2015, 2016. So I was like full blown into wine. Like, I mean, I was like deep in the wine world. So I was like living in the Willamette Valley. I was like tasting a lot of wine. Yeah. I was like driving a tractor. I was like out in fields every day. And then my mind just kind of like, it just kind of went click, click, and everything just kind of clicked into place. My buddy Tyler was like, hey, Chris Pettinger is looking for an intern at Skinner in El Dorado. You should take that. And I was like, okay. So I called Chris and we put it all together. And I finished harvest. Well, so I had already worked in New Zealand. So I worked in New Zealand just as for fun. I didn't know that I wanted to work in a cellar yet. I did that first. Then I baled hay again that summer. And then when I was done in like August, I was in Portland on the phone with Chris and I took my first internship in a cellar. Okay. So it already kind of had started from like New Zealand. So it was like kind of 15 working like harvest baling hay in Oregon. Then 16 was kind of like was New Zealand, and then working again in the summertime, and then hopping right. I was like, this was my life. I was like, what's next? What's next? What's next? Yeah. What's next? What's next? So that's kind of how that all played out. And then the moment, like literally just like that harvest, like my first harvest at Skinner in El Dorado, like it like immediately clicked. I was like, duh, like this is where you should be. You love the outdoors, you love agriculture, like you love like food, you love wine, you love like working with your hands. Like I've done that my whole life with everything that I've been interested in, and it just kind of all sort of like clicked for me. I mean, I'm a klutz in the cellar, by the way. Like, so like it wasn't like I wasn't a ballerina. Okay, I wasn't very graceful in the cellar, but it all clicked, and it was like a matter of just sort of like realizing that there was just certain paths that just weren't for me, and trying to figure out what path was for me. And this was a little later, by the way. I mean, I didn't start learning to make wine until I was like 33. Okay. which is like you look at interns in the wine industry, and like they were 10 years younger than me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That was also interesting in a lot of ways. You know?
Yeah. I mean, has its advantages and disadvantages being older, but
It does.
sometimes,
You're right.
sometimes you can be more ready for it and have a little different perspective on it. I think if you're a little older for something like that.
I agree with that. And I also think that I knew what I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like maybe when you're younger and you're like, you're still kind of figuring some stuff out. You're like, is this for me? Do I like this? I mean, it's a lot like, I've always thought that the idea of like graduating from high school at 18 and then immediately going to college to like get a degree in something is just like the worst idea. Now, by the way, going to college is awesome. And like if you are pursuing higher education, I 1000% think that that's awesome. And I'm not discouraging that. I just think that like you should try to do both. You should try to live a little life and go experience some stuff and figure out kind of what it is that you really want to do with your life. I don't think that going to 4 years of college and getting this like degree in this thing that you chose 4 years ago, or maybe you changed your major when you sort of figured out that you didn't want that, maybe you were lucky you were able to do that. I just don't know if that's the route. Do you know what I mean? Like, I just don't know if that's like the best way. Like I lived some life. I did some things. I did some traveling. I found what I loved, and then I like buckled down, got the work done, got to where I needed to be, and then, and then landed here where I am. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't think that I would have been able to do that at like 19 or not. I mean, at like, as a college, graduate or something, out of Davis or something like that. I just don't know if I would have been able to. College wasn't something that I was good at, anyways. So, I mean, that just wasn't the route for me. So I agree with you. I think that, kind of being older, like put me into more of an advantage in terms of me being able to, focus and complete something.
Yeah. And you probably learned what you loved, and you probably learned what you hated or disliked in that life experience also.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So Chris Pettinger, who's he's the winemaker at Limerick Lane and also has a brand called Grovant, which those wines are great. Mm-hmm. And he told me when I first was like going down this route, I was like, okay, like how does this work? And he was like, yeah, so he's like one thing that I will tell you is that when you work these internships, he's like, you're going to like, not only are you going to learn some things that you're going to carry with you like your whole career, and they're going to be the foundation of what you do. He's like, you're also going to learn how you don't want to make wine. He's like, it's important to work jobs making wine in a way that like you don't want to make wine, because you'll learn why you don't want to make it that way and why you don't want to do things this way. And so make sure that you take those things in well, learning the things that you don't want, you know?
So after your internships and you're making your barrel of Syrah at Turley, you decide to start the label. What was your next step from there? It's a pretty big jump once you have that first barrel. Now you have to sell it.
Yeah, I mean that part's not like foggy as in I don't remember it, but that part's just foggy as in I left Turley in January of 2020.
Okay.
And the reason I left is because I heard about a program at Folsom Lake College that was like basically like a viticulture and enology like program that they had introduced, and this was to kind of service the wine making community in the foothills.
Okay.
I think there was one class that was transferable. It was not a transferable course. This was a 2-year program, and it was a certificate, right? It wasn't like they weren't trying to pump you into Fresno or pump you into Davis or whatever. Mm-hmm. It was a program that was like just for folks to, learn some things about viticulture and enology and do it in a way that was affordable and accessible. Right.
A little more of a certificate kind
more
of.
More of a certificate, and also just kind of, and also again, to service like the foothills community, because there's so many wineries and so many vineyards like in the foothills.
Yeah.
And so it was like there wasn't really a program that was close to them for those people to access. Mm-hmm. So this was a great program. So I wanted to learn more. I could have stayed at Turley for who knows how many years, and I could have learned everything you could possibly need to know about making great wine.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned so much in such a small period of time. And that is just a drop in the bucket of like kind of what I think I could have learned. But I was older and I was impatient. And as I told you before, I really wanted to start my own thing.
Yeah.
So all those things kind of like came to a head. And I just made a very, very tough decision to leave. So I went and I did that program. And then we all know what happened next.
Yeah.
So I kind of was like, you know, I was already in a very weird place, you know, because it was like, okay, cool. Like you just quit your like very good, like full-time job. And you are now going back to part-time work and, or even just trying to find work, period. And you're like going back to school, which you haven't done in like a long time. And you're not very good at that. So I was just like, my head was like in this just insane place as it was. Like my ground was shaky as it was.
Yeah.
My mind was shaky as it was. And then the pandemic hit. And it was just like, what the fuck? You know, I just remember being like, a lot of us feel this way. Like it was just very strange. And, and the rug got pulled up from underneath me. And I think for a good like 4 or 5 months, there, my mind wasn't really thinking about wine or winemaking. You know, my mind was in 1,000 other places. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was topping my barrel. I was taking care of my wine. I wasn't like, oh, I don't care. You know, I was taking care of the wine still. And I had moved it to Harmeyer at that point.
Okay.
Yeah. So I had already, that was like the beginning of making wine at Harmeyer.
Okay.
So, which was also like a total godsend. It was like, fuck, like, okay, at least I have my barrel in some place that's like safe. It's a winery. It's a place that's close to home. Everything about that was just like perfect, you know?
Yeah.
And like, and I think I'm so thankful to Craig for taking me in, you know, like in that moment. Cause I couldn't imagine like having to figure anything else out otherwise. Cause I just was not in the space to do that, you know, even before the pandemic hit. And so that's kind of how that was. And then I was questioning everything. I was like, did I make the right decision? Like, should I make wine? Like, am I going to continue doing this? I was asking myself all those questions because I was just not in a good state of mind, period. You know, the pandemic was, I went through some, it was hard for me in my own way, just like it was hard for all of us in our own ways, you know, and I was not in a good mental state. And so I just, I wasn't super focused, you know, and again, you know, Tegan was just like, you know, I mean, for lack of a better term, he was just like, fucking snap out of it, dude. You know what I mean? You know, he's good at that. You know, he's just like, dude, just like get your shit together, you know, bottle the fucking wine, you know, get it going, you know, get your ABC permits and like, and do this, like, just that you're here. Like, just, that's, what are you going to do? You know what I mean? Like, just do it. And I was like, and I just was like, yeah, okay. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. I'm okay. And I just kind of needed that, like, I needed that shove.
Yeah.
You know, I just felt like I feel like the record was kind of skipping and I was just like, and I just needed someone to just like kind of push the needle forward and get it back and just kind of get it back on track. And
that's awesome.
Yeah. And so
it's able to do that.
Yeah. And so then I was already at Harmeyer, you know, so I bottled the 19 Syrah and, you know, and kind of pushed that around and, you know, then I added the Fox Creek Old Vine Zinfandel. So I made 2 wines in 20, which those wines I'm so proud of those wines, like especially like the Zinfandel. It's just like the 20 Zinfandel was just totally incredible. And that was another like extremely challenging year. It was insanely hot, you know, for just days on end. And there was a fire. There were fires. And so it was just another smoke year. So it was just like, crap, like, what is happening? You know, like, am I going to make smoke tainted wine? Like, you know, my very first like commercial vintage, like it just, you know, it was hairy, dude. Everything was hairy. It was just like, you're just flying by the seat of your pants. You're just like, you're not thinking about like, you're not thinking beyond what's in front of you. That's how harvest is. Like, you can't think about like, I mean, yes, you're making plans because you're like, okay, I need to pick this then. Like, you're doing that, but it's like, you're not like, oh, like, what's this going to be in 6 months? Or like, where am I going to be at in a year? Like you're like at that moment, I was just like, what is this fermentation? Like, what is happening? Like, like, is this okay? Like, oh my God, and it was just a lot of that, like in the beginning. And so, I mean, to me, it was just kind of like a little bit of a miracle to like make two really, that I thought were really great wines, like in 2020 that I'm super proud of. Like, I was just like, I just couldn't believe it. I was like, wow, like that's just a miracle that hiccup. And then, we kind of already talked about the 21 vintage. So that's kind of how that all started. It was just sort of like this big hiccup, and wasn't quite sure how I was going to come out of that. And then was able to, was fine. And in retrospect, I mean, the pandemic was really sort of the perfect opportunity, because it was like a lot of us just kind of had, like, we just had a lot of time, right?
Yeah. A lot of changes, a lot of time.
Yeah. A lot of changes, a lot of time,
Can you tell me a little bit about that Fox Creek vineyard?
Fox Creek is a vineyard that is located in the Shenandoah Valley in Amador County. And it is one of the oldest vineyards in the region. So it's been around, since the sort of like late 1800s, like early 1900s.
Okay.
And it's changed hands a few times over the years. It's a very well-known vineyard in the sense that like many different winemakers have made wine from the vineyard over the years. The Gotts like kind of got their start there.
Okay.
They started a winery there. Basically, Carrie Gott's wife's father kind of purchased the property many years ago.
Is that the Montevina?
Montevina, exactly. Okay. Yep. So Joel kind of like, there's like pictures of Joel like, driving tractor and like, on the property, and like, there's that history there. I can't speak too much about that because I don't really know the Gott family. So, we can have them tell those stories. But and then James and Sue Fox bought the vineyard and have farmed it. James has now passed away, and so Sue continues to farm the vineyard. It went to certain blocks went to Buck Cobb from Carly, and so he was making wine from that vineyard, and it was like one of his sort of prized like Zinfandel wines and Zinfandel based wines, and so I think that he was kind of one of the guys that kind of in the modern age kind of like was putting it on the map. And there were other producers that were making wine from that vineyard as well. But I think he was kind of one of the guys, because, if you look back, on the like kind of 70s and 80s and 90s, that time during kind of Shenandoah Valley, like winemaking, there was a very small group of people who were making like what I would consider fine wine, and Carly was like certainly, in that very small group of people. And so like he was kind of, he knew the potential of that fruit, and he knew the quality of it, and he was making some great wines. So I got turned on to it through my buddy Mark Fowler, who's the winemaker at Andis. And I met Mark when I was at Skinner because he was the associate winemaker there. And Mark is one of my like closest friends. He's he like grew up in a cellar, and his family like owned a winery in Amador, and they planted a vineyard. And so he like literally just grew up in a winery, and he has worked at many different wineries in the foothills. And he's, I think, just one of the most like talented, knowledgeable, most like down to earth. Like I can't say this enough. I just feel like Amador County is just like, and just the foothills in general are just like so lucky to have that dude. And so I kind of got my foundation for winemaking. I got that from him. And so he was really the first dude that like taught me like how to work in a cellar with cleanliness, with efficiency, with intention, and do things in a way where like you're not being a dumbass, And so he like really was kind of like the guy who kind of gave me the foundation that I have to this day. And so Mark, when I was looking to make a second wine in 2020, I was talking to Mark, and I was like, hey, like if you know of anything, like I'd love to make some Zin. I'd love to make some old vine Zin. And he was like, hey, I know that Fox Creek has this old, like super old vine block. It's like the original like planting that's left.
Wow.
There isn't, it's like centennial vines. It's the only block that's left from the original planting.
Okay.
And I know that like it doesn't really go anywhere. Like I don't think anybody takes it or whatever. And it's like, so, I'm sure you could give them a buzz and like I'm sure you could ask about getting the fruit. And so sure enough, I called over there and I just met up with one of the vineyard guys, Willie, and he was like, "Yeah, man, it's yours." And I was like, "So I mean, it's microscopic. It's just like tiny little corner end of so it's like a teardrop, and it's kind of the end of the teardrop, and it's like this tiny little block and old like gnarly, like super old vines. The vineyard's dying, the block is dying. It's got phylloxera, like most likely. I mean, I don't think that's been totally confirmed, but like you can kind of tell, like it's just sort of very, very slowly dying. So I made the 2020 wine like kind of exclusively like from that block.
Okay.
So I made like I think I barely squeaked out a barrel. I think I had to figure out some topping wine.
Yeah.
Like it was like I barely filled a barrel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why that wine is just like so good, because it's like 100% from that like old vine block.
Is that old vine Zin? Is it all Zin in that?
Yeah, sorry, did I not say that? Yeah,
well,
sorry.
no, I was just
yeah.
You did say it was Zinfandel. I didn't know if there was like interplanting or anything like that. Like if there's some Barbera hanging out in the corner of it.
First of all, it's not that big.
Okay.
To even try to figure out if there's like something else interplanted. I'm sure there might be a vine or two, and maybe at some point there was a vine or two. Maybe those ones are dead. I have no idea. But pretty much what's there is Zinfandel.
But it's Zinfandel.
It's mostly Zinfandel. There's interplantings in the other blocks.
Okay.
For sure. Yeah. Including some white varieties. I made the wine, and I just was like, I had tasted the wine before because Andis had made the wine. And so I was able to taste, with Mark and kind of like, I knew what the wine tasted like. I always really liked it. I was like, oh man, I just love, like, it just has this like very intense, like raspberry, flavor, which I just really love. And the wine is just so aromatic, and it's just such a pleasure to drink. The wine is, I don't want to get too like geeky or technical with it. It's just like the wine has so much pleasure when you drink it. And so when I made the 20, I was just like, oh my God, this wine is so awesome. So I kind of, I tried to duplicate that in 21, and I picked all of that vineyard plus a little bit from across the creek, which, is in like a younger block, which is like, in air quotes, 80 plus years old. So I kind of filled in the bins with that. So that was still like kind of like 100% old vine stuff. And then this year I picked two separate. So I picked some slightly younger stuff, some kind of like 40-year-old stuff. And so I made wine from that, which is excellent. Same plant material when they replanted. Okay. And so that's like same clone. So it's like just the wine is so great. And then I picked the old vine, my little old vine block, and then I filled in another bin from across the creek again, and I fermented that separately.
Okay.
And then I pressed that, and it's been aging in a 500-liter puncheon.
Oh.
And
nice.
so that's going to be kind of like I'm going to do like an old vine bottling.
Mm-hmm.
And then very, very sadly, I learned this year that they're ripping it out.
Oh,
really? So this
Okay.
this is the last year that I'll make wine from the oldest vines,
stuff.
and then
Okay.
after this year it's gone.
Oh, that's too bad.
It is too bad. So I think that I we got a lot of rain, and I'm hoping that it crops to like at least like I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that like I can get like at least like a half ton, which means I could make a barrel. Like I would just love to just make just like the last year that the vines are in the ground. I'd love to just make that same wine that I made in 2020, like where it's just 100% from that block, just to honor the block kind of one last time.
Yeah. So 2023 is
that's it.
That's the end.
As far as I know, I mean, that's
Yeah.
the news that I got.
Yeah.
So things are already changing in the like very short period of time that I've been making wine up there. Like
Yeah.
some things are not going to be available to me, and some new doors have opened, some doors
Yeah.
closed, some doors open,
Yeah.
So the wines are changing, the wines are evolving, and I started making Lodi wine.
Mhm. And you're making the wines out there in Lodi
I make the wines
also
in
now.
I make the wines in
right?
Lodi. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's like it's called Lodi Crush.
Okay.
Yeah. So Gerardo Espinoza there, he's super lovely dude. Like just he's such a good guy. Like I'm so happy that I get to make the wines there, and we're just I try to be a good roommate,
Yeah.
I'm kind of a pain in the ass, but he puts up with me. And so I've only been there a year, so we're going to move into year 2. So hopefully we have a good harvest, and I'm looking forward to making more Lodi wine, so I'm going to grow that part of my portfolio.
Yeah. You have some, the spring release wines you have, I guess, one is all Lodi and the other is a pretty good portion of Lodi, right?
Exactly.
The
Yeah.
Cinsault and then the
Cinsault,
with some
the
Riesling.
22 Cinsault from Kirschman. Yeah. So all those are available on the website, perchwineco.com. Go buy some wine.
The Syrah, how much whole cluster are you doing on that? Feels
100%.
like it's 100%? Okay.
All day long. Yeah.
Okay.
Same thing with the Cinsault.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, I think that if you talk to a lot of winemakers who make whole cluster wine, it's like, it's all or nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know some people experiment with stuff. They're like, oh, we did 25% or 50%, or this block was, or this lot was 100% whole cluster, and then we blended it with this stuff that wasn't, or whatever. And I get that. And I'm not saying that those wines are bad or whatever. I'm not saying that's like not the way to do it. And also I don't have enough data, from my own wines to definitively say that, or whatever. But it's like, if I'm going to do whole cluster, it's just like, it's whole cluster, I'm not going to be like, I'm not going to mess around, and like try to, do partial this or partial that or whatever, Yeah. I mean, the only thing that I have done that I experimented with just because I could at that moment, and I just kind of was like, whatever, we'll just see what happens, is that with the 21 Zinfandel, I destemmed all the fruit, and then I added back like 10% stems. Okay. So I just put a little bit of stems into the fermentation, just to like give it a little bit of more texture, maybe a little bit more tannin, maybe a little bit more like stuffing, if you will, because I knew the wine was low sugars. So it was kind of me to sort of preemptively like trying to kind of fill in some spaces with the wine if I could, which I'm happy that I did that, because I think that it was a good decision. It definitely it definitely has helped the wine in a lot of ways, so I think it has made the wine a little bit more interesting. So, but I mean, I think whole cluster is the way to go. Like with 100% whole cluster is the way to go, with definitely with the Syrah.
Yeah, it really comes through on the Syrah,
Yeah, totally.
The whole cluster. So it makes lovely.
And I've always really loved whole cluster wines. I've drank some of the best wines, and some of the wines that like stick out of my memory and that just like kind of bring me the most pleasure. Like a lot of them have been whole cluster wines. Whole cluster Carignan and whole cluster Gamay, Beaujolais, and like whole cluster Syrahs and whole cluster Pinot Noir. I mean, there's just like so many great whole cluster wines, that I totally vibe with. So it's been fun to make the wines like that. Plus, like, I mean, to be fair, like from a winemaking perspective, it's like, just dump it in, like give it a tread, and
stomp
it's
it
like
a little bit,
like, and like, and in terms of like processing, you have whole cluster wine coming in, and you're like, hey man, we're not dirtying any equipment. We're just popping it right into the fermenter. You know what I mean? No sorting table, no crusher, no destemmer. Like, I mean, from an easy day on the crush
practical
pad
standpoint.
Yeah, it's just like, I mean, I'm like, fuck, I wish I could just make everything whole cluster. It's like just from a lazy standpoint.
Yeah. Do you have your eye on some other fruit in Lodi that you'd like to?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have my eye on things, but I'm not going to talk about those things just because, like, I don't want to be talking, be counting my chicks before they're hatched. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, and also the thing is that, I've been making wine from the foothills and been making wine in the foothills for other people, since like basically, 2016, so I've been able to get to know some of the vineyards up there, and I kind of know some of the great vineyards up there. And it's taken me that long to get a base knowledge of some of the vineyards up there. And I feel like I only know so much, and there's still a lot of great vineyards out there that I don't know of and that I haven't tasted wine from. And so there's still a lot to learn there. But like Lodi is I'm just the tip of the iceberg there. Like I have no idea. You know what I mean? I mean, I know a handful of vineyards because certain people that I really like and whose wines I like. You know, the precedent wines. You know, those wines are just fantastic. And obviously, like the Sandlands wines from Tegan's stuff from Lodi, and there's like some producers that I really like that are making some great Lodi wines, and so I kind of am familiar with some of the vineyards, but I'm still getting to know them. So
yeah,
and I don't want to make. I'm just not really interested to make wine from vineyards that aren't interesting and great. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm only making a little bit of wine, so it's not like I have this like gigantic facility and I have a huge case production and I can just play around with different lots every year. I have to be more intentional. You know, I have to be really intentional with the wines I'm making. You know, I don't really have the space or the like luxury to like make wine from a vineyard that's not very interesting and then make a wine that's not very interesting and then just be like, and then blend it away or something. Do you know what I mean? Or like put it in my like, second label or something like that. Like I just don't really have the luxury to do that. Everything that I put my label on, like I want it to be something that I'm like really proud of and something that's like, I'm like, hey, like I picked this for a reason. You know what I mean? I'm making this wine for a reason, Again, coming back to that conversation we were having earlier, like with, making the wines with intention.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about the label name and the artwork?
Totally. Yeah. So Perch Wine Company. Perch comes from like as in a bird perched. So my family, my mom and my sister Miranda and myself, like we've all like kind of always been interested in like birds and like bird watching. And that passion started when my parents owned about 6 acres in the south area of Sacramento. And so our region is on the Pacific Flyway. And so there's like a lot of bird species that come in and out of our area over the course of the year. And there's vernal pools that are out there. And so we would just have a lot of birds that would come, kind of in and out of that area. And so like, I just, we had a pair of binoculars and I lived out there for a while with them. And so I just got really kind of like, I don't know what it was. It was just sort of like something that I really enjoyed doing. I always really enjoyed hiking and camping, being out in nature. I've always really loved animals. And so like, bird watching was just kind of like that thing that I was just sort of, that I latched onto. So I've just got into birds. And so when I started the brand, I just wanted something that was just sort of like very like genuine and just represented who I was and just kind of was very, very true to who I was as a person. And so I knew that I wanted it to be bird related. Okay. I couldn't come up with a name. I was having a super hard time. One of my close friends and 2 of my close friends, my friend Jonathan Kloneke and his wife Michelle, I was over at their house one night in the backyard and we were having dinner. And it was kind of one of those like COVID-ish dinners where you're like in the backyard, like everyone's kind of like spaced out, and, kind of thing. And like, we're all sort of just, a lot of us hadn't seen each other like in person. So we're like kind of catching up, like talking about our lives. And I'm just kind of like lamenting about how I'm having a hard time coming up with a name. And she just sort of appears, from the kitchen, with something in her hand to like drop off the table. And she's like, well, what about Perch? Just like that.
Yeah.
And it was just very like, it was very just sort of in the moment. And I was like, that's it. You know what I mean? I was like, and it was just, there wasn't even a question. There wasn't a conversation about it. I didn't have to think about it. It was like, that's it. And I just made sure that like nobody else had it. And then I just immediately kind of like got going on it. So that's where the name came from. And then the birds, I draw all the birds. So awesome. those are all sketches that I have done in the past or that I do uniquely for each label. They're just little like, pen and ink, a little bit of watercolor sometimes on the sketches. They're pretty intentional. Like the birds, like the bird that's on the Zinfandel is a black phoebe. My mom is a big fan of Zinfandel. She's a Zinfandel drinker. And so I asked her what bird she wanted on the Zinfandel. And she said she wanted a black phoebe. So that's the bird we put on there. And then the bird that's on the Syrah is a turkey vulture. And so that is a bird that is just ubiquitous up in the foothills and all over California.
Yeah.
And a bird that I just think is like sort of understated and kind of underappreciated and just such an interesting, like, kind of cool bird. So that's the bird that's on there. The bird that's on the Sauvignon Blanc that we're drinking is a sandhill crane. And that one's not super intentional because sandhill cranes are not, they're not hanging out in Amador County. You know what I mean? That label was just like very intentional for different ways. Like the pink, or sort of like, I think of it as more of like mauve. That's what we were kind of going for. That color was like intentional, and like I just kind of wanted the label to look really neat. It was like the first white wine that I made, and so I kind of wanted to just be like something that was like kind of different than the other labels, and so that's kind of how that came together. And then the Cinsault has a Swainson's Hawk with some cherries dangling out of its mouth, because that is from the Kirscherman vineyard in Lodi, Tegan's vineyard. And so there is a Swainson's Hawk that lives or a mating pair that lives in a tree just over the river past the vineyard, because the vineyard's in an oxbow.
Oh, very cool.
And so that was a very easy selection. Yeah. So that's kind of where the birds come from. I try to, figure out a bird that should go on there that kind of fits with like the label and the wine and like the place and all that stuff. So, yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah. I think it's important that folks understand that I'm on the Indie Wine podcast, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm on this podcast for a reason, because I'm an independent, like small, like micro, like wine producer, and I'm growing this brand, and I'm growing this business, because it is a small business, and there's no other way to look at it, and it's hard, it's challenging. Like I've seen other small producers like in our industry who make way more wine than I do, by the way, who are still considered like very, very small producers. I think in the world of wine, like sub 10,000 cases is considered a small winery. That's a lot of wine.
It is.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
10,000 cases is a lot of wine. And that's a different tax bracket, So I am not anywhere near that. I made 400 cases last year. So like, in order for me to kind of continue to do this and do what I'm doing, really essential for me, really important for me to grow my DTC, right? DTC is direct to consumer. What does that mean? That means buying wine like on my website, like directly from me, And that's like super, super important. And I'm so happy that my wines are at like some wine shops in Sacramento, and are at places like Cordy Brothers and different wine bars like Betty and Good News and Nico, and shops like Beyond Napa. And like, there's just so many great places in Sacramento that I love that, that have been supporting the wines. And I'm so happy that those wines are there. And that introduces my wines to people that normally wouldn't find my wine through me or through my Instagram or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I just want people to know that like, if you really want to support like an indie wine brand, an independent wine producer, you should 1000% like buy it directly from them, And I know it might be less convenient, and I know it might be a little bit more money because maybe you have to pay for shipping. I totally understand that. And I'm not saying that you should feel guilty if you buy it at the wine shop. I'm happy that you buy the wines anywhere you find them, and I'm always going to feel that way. But I just think that it's really important, for folks to realize that, in order for small producers like me to really grow our brands and to grow what we're doing and to kind of continue to evolve and keep these wines, kind of on, out there in the world and available to folks, it's important that they, try to support the winemakers like directly, and that's like ordering directly on their websites.
Thanks for listening today to our interview with Adam. He's only a few vintages in, but already making really refined and great wines. They're available in stores, but the spring release is live right now on his website if you want to grab some bottles directly from the source, perchwineco.com or perchwineco on Instagram. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening, on Instagram at IndieWinePodcast, and feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too, I'd really appreciate it. There's also now a Patreon set up if you feel like supporting the podcast to hopefully allow more episodes, more travel, and to help defray other costs. Link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one. Bye.